Thousands of people on the street in the midnight and biting cold. Why? Because the then sitting president had just announced martial law. The whole world is just grappling what is happening, but perhaps the citizens have a fair idea of what they need to do. And they did it exactly that. Hundreds and thousands on the street, followed by 190 parliamentarians marching towards the parliament. Despite being prevented by the guards, they entered the building and they nullified the martial law. This is happening not in a country which is emerging, not a developing society, but one of the OECD countries. You would wonder how it was possible. It became possible because of the previous experiences and because of the quality of knowledge about one key notion, that is rule of law by the people. I'm talking about South Korea, and the city was Seoul. What is remarkable here is that the people recognized the complexity and the criticality of understanding rule of law. Damas and Heron, this is Sanjay Sharma, and you have just started watching your favorite program, Expectarians. Today, we have two segments for you. First one is on rule of law, and the second one on expat entrepreneurship. The question that we are asking today is not just how critical is rule of law for us, but also how critical is for our collective flourishing, for collective well-being, amidst the turbulences that we see today in the world, shifting global alliances, domestic politics is quite turbulent, and the technology changing rapidly. When we talk about rule of law, the general notion could be that it's a very static, very dry notion, courts, and constitutions. But if you realize it's a very living structure, living organism, where it breathes with us. It's like the same analogy. If you ask a fish, do you know water? Probably it would not be able to explain it. The moment you take it out, it says like, I want to go back where? But now perhaps it's already too late. And this is how it is about rule of law. It has a propensity and possibility of getting weakened very silently, fracture internally, and can collapse suddenly unless or if we leave it unattended or unsupervised. To unpack all these questions related to the theme, we have a wonderful panel today. And before I move forward, I would like to introduce them. This conversation joining us today is Marco de Jong. He is a former diplomat, advisory board member of ASEAN Chamber of EU, and he's also a CEO of Euralinks. Welcome, Marco, to the show.
Thank you.
Next, we have Fabrizio Guarliglia. He is the Director, International Development Law Organization, IDLO, the Hague branch. Welcome, Fabrizio, to the show.
So much.
And joining us is also Richard Gyasi. He is a Director of Geostat, the think tank on geopolitics, and he's a lecturer at the Institute of Political Science, Leiden University. Welcome.
Thank you.
And finally, I'm super delighted to have Valérie Gabach. She's co-director of Uprights, that focuses on human rights and advancement of rule of law-based programs. Welcome to you all. I would like to start with our city. We are sitting in The Hague, which used to be the home of the father of international law, Hugo Grotius, and also Spinoza, the philosopher of peace. I would like to ask each of you a very brief impression of what do you think Hague's significance and contribution is as international city of peace and justice. Marco, would you like to start?
Yes. The Hague is, in my personal opinion, creating a environment and the tools to uphold the rule of law. But it's up to if what they do with those rule of laws. You can see in the recent geopolitical developments that we've created these rule of laws, The Hague as a city of peace and justice, but it merely creates tools rather than a political will that is still needed.
Okay. Fabricio?
Yeah, I think that the Hague epitomizes what one could refer to as the international dimension of the rule of law, and in particular multilateralism as a means to ensure that disputes are resolved in a peaceful manner, to ensure that rights are consolidated and spread, that claims are properly enforced, that there is resort to a mechanism, and in The Hague, particularly judicial mechanisms, to obtain redress for the violation of rights. So in a way, it epitomizes a reaction to the rule of the mighty, a reaction to the idea that disputes should be resolved by force, and the strongest one wins. So in that sense, it retains even today a very strong symbolic message that perhaps is becoming now more necessary than ever before.
That's true, that's true. Richard, what will you say?
Those are good reflections. I actually wanted to use or refer to symbolism as well. Of course, it's important that The Hague, City of International Justice, rule of law, peace as well is there. But of course, in practice, it is quite limited. Think of Palestine, think of Venezuela, think of Libya. It's a long list. So in practice, quite limited, reflecting, of course, the nature of international law as it has always been limited.
True.
Yes, I mean, obviously my reflections would also be from the international perspective, so I would join a lot of what's just say here. I think for me what also represents The Hague as a city of peace and justice is that I would say it's one of the very few places in the world where this justice is visible, because you have here, there's not so many international mechanisms to settle disputes and hold criminal accountable, but two of them, and the two main one, let's say, are here in The Hague, the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. And I think in these times where international law and the rule of law at the international level is quite challenged, it's still a place where if you want to see it living, it is here. So I think it's quite important to give it a living.
Absolutely. Actually, this was also interesting for me, the story that I just mentioned about of South Korea. And after this incident happened, I called a friend of mine and I asked him, what exactly does it mean to you? And the answer was very revealing, very basic, but very powerful. And they say, 이게 그냥 보통 개념이 아니라 법치주의는 국가 권력으로부터 그 개인의 자유와 권위를 보장하기 위해서 원리다. That means the rule of law is actually that protects you from the power, protects your rights, your freedom from the state power. So before we move forward, can we just quickly define these terms like rule of law and rule by law for our laymen, our viewers? Who would like to start with?
I would like to start.
Please, yeah.
So often people are mistaken with the rule of law as an ideal, but I see it more in a practical way, that it's merely about predictability. Society demands predictability from who's in power, and I think the rule of law avoids the situation where power shifts, that also the rule of law changes. So it's all about predictability.
Okay, Patricia?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that. I think that legal certainty is part of the rule of law in what is called the thing version or the thing aspect of the rule of law, which is the rule of law as a protection, the rule of law as a barrier that shields us from predictability, the existence of an independent judiciary, our rights not to be taken from our homes and tossed into a dark cell somewhere. Roosevelt's freedoms, in the end, kind of like this idea that basically you're free from fear in the context of the rule of law. But then you have the other dimensions, which are as important. The idea that you can develop in an equal society, that basically you have equality of opportunities, that you have access to basic services, that you have access to sanitation, that you have access to everything that can lead you to a good life, that you are in a way, in a sense, given the opportunities to develop your life plan in a proper manner. And then there is an international dimension of rule of law, which we discussed earlier, right? So basically you have multiple aspects of the rule of law. It's a very multifaceted concept in many ways, which basically, if you analyze it properly, covers things as different as our rights in a criminal trial to our ability to petition to the municipality that, you know, our water is clean and drinkable for our children.
Perfect.
I think that predictability is core, as was mentioned. I think equality, that all are equal in the eye of law, whether it's domestic or international, is important. It brings, or it should bring, structure. Generally it does. Transparency, of course. Basically, if you want to simplify it, it's the rules of the road, right? And international society, to borrow from, say, Hedley Bull, requires as much as possible structure, predictability, and equality. So, in theory, that is international law, or at least what it should be.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not going to repeat what was said. Obviously, predictability and equality are very fundamental notions under the rule of law. And maybe to respond to the idea that this should not be an abstract notion, but it's about also the concrete consequences. That's true that the rule of law as a concept will always be maybe an ideal or something abstract, but it gave us a framework of reference, I think, to build society on. And we're going to talk a lot about the international side of it, and the rule of law at the international level is very fragile. For me, at the level of the international level, it's really about avoiding chaos, right? Trying to give a little bit of predictability and avoiding arbitrariness. But I think at the national level, the rule of law, of course, is much more complex, right? The set of rules that we have that protect citizens against arbitrariness and powerful is much more developed. And sometimes I think it's important to, it seems like an abstract concept, but the reality is that it's so entrenched in everything the society that we've built in terms of predictability that we take it maybe in Europe a little bit for granted, and that it's important. We don't forget that the reason why we could develop international partnerships and live our life as we do in the Netherlands is because there is the rule of law behind it.
While I was listening to you, I had to think of Hannah Arendt. She gives the concept of a banality of evil. And very vividly, she points out that heinous crimes are not committed by evil people. They are committed by ordinary people, mundane, but just these are the people who decided, or for some whatever reason, chose not to critically think, but follow blindly. And this happens in any society. It can happen if people are not aware of these concepts, how much pivotal they are to their own flourishing, collective flourishing. So my question to you all is, if you can reflect, do you think that we are teaching our youngsters these basic concepts? Because we are living in the age of STEM, science technologies, like highly, popularized. But the concepts like ethics, morality, philosophy, politics, do we have enough input for our youngsters so that they can understand that ultimate purpose of life is not just to get a job, but to live in a society where everybody can flourish?
Absolutely, if I may. I just wanted to also add, as one of the key concepts of rule of law before, order and coexistence. But on your question specifically, Sanjay, no, we don't. We teach them about a lot, and quite often selectively. But look, in my book, The Nature of the Universe is harmony, is peace. War starts, conflict starts, acrimony starts, they all start one place, human mind. So what we actually need to study teach our youngsters is the nature of their mind. Obviously, we are completely remiss. There's a small handful of countries, think of Bhutan, that stress that a little more, but by and large, including in Europe, we don't. When I engage, for instance, with scholars, observers, analysts, including not too long ago, a fairly big name, works on international peace, and my question was, what is your definition of peace? That individual was not able to answer it. And so the fundamentals of peace, harmony, coexistence, of which international law, in my case, and international order, what I generally focus on, those underpin it. And those are the practical embodiments of it. But it's not the point of departure that they should be studying.
Yeah. So you do believe there is a dire need that we actually inculcate or bring a sizable chunk on these themes in the curriculum for youngsters at an early age?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
What would you say, Fabrizio?
Yeah, I think there is the two dimensions there. One is how do we engage the youth in rule of law and rule of law conversations, and there's been a trend in recent years of ensuring adequate youth engagement, active youth engagement, in the sense that this is not something that can be decided by the older generation without adequate consultation and seeking the views and engaging the youth in being part of that conversation and proposing ideas and bringing initiatives to the table. So you have that. The second thing is what I think you were referring quite rightly as the educational aspect. How do we create new generations of rule of law thinkers and rule of law champions in this context? And I think that we are in a context where some red flags are starting to appear, in the sense of, for instance, social media creating a parallel dimension of normativization of behavior and transmission of values that run completely contrary to what we want to see in a rule of law context. So that is another big challenge for the coming generations, and I think, and we'll see what happens now with the new generations that grow completely, at the difference with our generation, in a digital world. Mm-hmm. We belong to the generation of still books and written word, with television and radio as the big innovations. We'll see now what happens when we look at the outcome of these processes in the coming generations and what are the implications for the rule of law.
Marco?
Yeah, and when you mention about the digitalization, I immediately was triggered like, okay, what information is real and what's not real? Yes. That's for the new generation so difficult to judge. I think more importantly is, we can have a curriculum where we teach the rule of law and how we would like to define it and share it. But I think the most important is that the world leaders give the right example. Otherwise, those are empty words. So I think that's very critical, that they keep faith in the rule of law that's being created, and that's why I also say it often is seen as an ideal, mm-hmm. but it's how you put it in practice.
Very well said. Actually, that again reminds me of the German theologian Martin Niemöller. He has written the poem, "First they came for the socialist, I was not a socialist, yes. So I did not speak out. Then they came for the communist, I was not. And when they came for me, nobody was left to help me." This is what is happening if we don't, or if we take it for granted, or if we have indifference or apathy for rule of law. So the question that we can ask, how would you read the incidents happening, say, Venezuela, or threats to Greenland or Taiwan, let alone there are 2 wars going on, rule of law? Please,
can
go ahead.
Start with that. So first, maybe just to frame a little bit, rule of law at the international level is to some degree in a very archaic or young form, since which mostly relates to the most concrete system is since the end of the Second World War, right? As a reaction of the Second World War, and it's hard to compare to the rule of law as we know it in a European country where it goes to a set of rules that are developed are really important. At the international level, the rules are pretty basic to some degree, and they were built as a reaction to learning from history, right? That we do not want something like the Second World War to happen again. And the champion of that system and the one carrying it was the United States of America. It is far away from being perfect. It has never been fully implemented, and I don't think anyone would be naive to think that United States was not using the system for its own power before. But I think the main difference with what's happening with Trump America is that what Venezuela and Greenland and other actions before that is the lack of intention to even refer to international law and to just put ahead that most powerful should win, which is very problematic that it is the US because they are the one who have created that system. So, I mean, we're maybe not surprised when Russia invade Ukraine but when it comes from the US, it is more or less the people who created that system who is now pushing it to be destroyed. So it's very uncertain time, but it's very uncertain time. But that doesn't mean it's a phase. Maybe I don't know. Maybe we can go longer into that.
Yeah.
What I think of that.
I think that international law, and indeed led mostly by the US, collective West, including us here in Europe, was never quite meant to equalize at the international level. I think it was more of a stabilizer for an unequal system. I think what we here in Europe tend to forget, willingly or unwillingly, is that the US mostly, and there's another actor, that have violated international law again and again and again since 1945. We in Europe have generally been either compliant or complicit. We decided to close one eye or both eyes, and sometimes indeed partake. Libya comes to mind. I think what's changed now, and I think in that sense Trump and his movement, they continue this tradition, except the pretense or the pretext of human rights, freedom, liberalization. Those are gone. There's less sugarcoating. It's much more raw. But it is a continuation. I think the reason why we now, Venezuela was still, remember, there was only a couple of days ago, most of Europe remained silent. We only got vocal when we were not part of being protected. As long as we were in the corner where the punches didn't fall, the rest of the world got the punches, Europe was again compliant, complicit. But now that we are being threatened as well, we say, well, international law is being, trampled upon by Trump and his movement. I think that argument is flawed.
I think I was going back to the history of the Peloponnese War, and Thucydides saying, well, what was Athens' international relations policy, and it was the strong do what they can and the wicked do what they must. We've had double standards in the international legal order forever, and I think Mark Carney's recent speech in Davos was interesting in the sense that we said, look, we always knew there was a degree of exceptionalism for great powers. I have a bit of I feel the picture is, I completely agree with you in the sense of saying there has always been this. I think that we had, in the words of Michael Walzer, constitutional moments in the evolution of international law. The 90s were a very particular moment because we saw a renaissance of multilateralism, pushed by middle states primarily. And you have some amazing hits like the anti-personal landmines treaty, or the treaty creating the International Criminal Court, which was revolutionary. And there, I mean, I would say it was against the will of the great powers that we got some of those milestones. I think that since September 11, what we see is an erosion, gradual, of multilateralism and of international legal order, an increase in the double standards and the use of double standards, and now we're in a situation where that has become exacerbated. And we see asymmetrical reaction to violations of international norms. We see sometimes, shameless infraction to the rules of international law, the provision of the use of force, and violations of human rights law and international humanitarian law in a fashion that we thought we were never going to see again, and muted responses or variable responses depending on who the actor behind the violations is. I think that there is obviously the only thing that one can do is refuse to normalize that situation. And continue to stand by the values behind multilateralism, behind the UN Charter, behind the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights, the basic constitutional elements of our fragmented international rule of law world, and really demand for different actions and different reactions.
Marco, do you share the same thoughts, or?
Yeah, problems arise when rules become selective or optional, and that affects also geopolitics, trade. From my own experience, look at the Deforestation Act. In the negotiations with the Asian countries, there you see that there's conflict with the WTO and the rule of law that we like to see. So there's always a tension between what's in place, what is the goal, and is it in harmony with the other parties, or is it imposed on the other parties?
Precisely. I think that that's a good point, because that reminds me of the Asian financial crisis of 97, 98, when Korea was given IMF bailout package, and the terms and conditions were too stringent. Later, yes, even IMF admitted that vis-a-vis countries like Mexico or Brazil. So that has been actually very nicely captured. You mentioned about Canadian Prime Minister Carney, and I wrote down, so just for the sake of our viewers, he said, we knew that the story of rules-based international order was partially false. This fiction was useful. The trade rules were enforced asymmetrically, and we know that the international law was applied depending on the identity of the accused or victim. We participated in the ritual. We avoided calling the gap between rhetoric and reality, and we got benefited. So it's a very, open and clear expression that we were part of it. Now the next question, yes, that has happened and we are aware. And the question is, taking the computer lingo, do you think a reboot or reinstallation of the software is sufficient, or we need to actually have a new operating system for the world? Just tweaking is not sufficient anymore. What would you say? Yeah.
Well, if I may, look, a couple of things. One is that international order, of which international law is a part, by and large has done quite a bit of good as well. Let's say it's avoided great power wars. Since the end of the Second World War, they have not fought each other directly. That's a major achievement. By and large, prosperity worldwide, peace worldwide, by and large, lately a little less so perhaps, have been positive. International law, by and large, also send a package, we order something from overseas, internet, travel, and so on. By and large, they work as well. Almost all countries in the world, most of the time, abide by international law as well. Where you see the violations, it's mostly the larger actors, sometimes domestically, but when it comes to violence and power, right, that's where international law tends to fail. Of course, international law is not a sovereign, so it doesn't have that kind of curbing power. I think a reboot in that regard is not necessary. Of course, norms, we see that there's a contestation going on. China is a lead in that, India is a lead in that, others which propose new norms. You see indivisible security, shared future, world as one family, all very positive. I think the biggest challenge, of course, still lies at that, apex of violence and power. That, unfortunately, international law will most likely have difficulty dealing with. It seems that power is generally either curbed by their own morality, which unfortunately quite often is missing, or by counterpower. It can be asymmetric, doesn't need to be. But it's important, and in conclusion, that not only the middle powers, such as Prime Minister Carney has propagated, which is important, get together, but the middle powers alone will not be sufficient. So doing this together with the major powers, with India, with China, with Brazil and others, will remain key.
Yeah.
I think, one thing that IDLO keeps repeating is the importance of, preserving multilateralism as a value and as a process, and in many ways. But another thing that basically our Director General has been repeating many times is, look, the rule of law is the immune system of democracy, and it retains this critical function. But at the same time, it has to be acknowledged that basically there are a number of unsatisfied demands that are leading to an increase in authoritarianism and leading to a decrease in violent responses to different issues. And I think that if there is a reboot that is required, perhaps at the international level will be a more equal and symmetric and predictable international legal order and a reaffirmation of the importance of the international norms underpinning the international legal order. At the domestic level, the democracies have to start to deliver in relation to the problems that people are experiencing: housing, access to sanitation, access to public services, affordability, ability to basically raise your family in a proper manner. These are the concerns that people are having. Impunity for corruption, vulnerability to organized crime. A number of things that ultimately, at the end of the day, if they're not properly addressed by democratic systems and by rule of law-based orders, they end up basically creating a fertile ground for autocratic responses, populism, and with that comes the rest.
Here, actually, I would just like to have a follow-up question. Generally, people don't really understand how to detect those cracks in the system. And if I can take the analogy from the aviation sector, if you look at any crash investigation, they talk about that the crash itself was the outcome, but it was a chain reaction of many small misses, whether it was a technical glitch, whether it's like a pilot's complacency or a human error or just negligence in the maintenance or anything. That those are small things which are manageable, but when put together, compounded, they end up in disaster, catastrophe. So can you pinpoint some of the cracks within rule of law that people can actually start seeing that, hey, we need to be very careful and in time? Who would like to take? Yeah?
Some of the cracks. I think a very obvious one of the cracks of what we are seeing in the rule of law or the international law, and again I repeat, it's because I think because of their power and the fact that they were the one holding that systems, it creates a very visible, massive crack in that system, right? But obviously that is, to me, just what makes it visible. And as it was said before, it was already there, and there's a number of cracks that we can already see in the system for numbers of years, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the situation in Israel-Palestine, and also the way states have been or not reacting towards that. So clearly there is a shift here, but it's also at the national level. I have to say, it seems that there is a tendency for national to turn back a bit, maybe toward themselves. We also see it in Europe a lot around the discussion around the migration route and the Mediterranean area, which is something we worked on, and how we deal with this question very differently than 20 years ago, maybe. Although for me, if we're talking about rebooting the system, I don't know if we are there yet. I'm a little bit of an idealistic, so I would hope that the system that we have now would reboot in a way that push for the value that my organization is pushing for. So more rule of law, actually, and more human rights, and less war, and less, for the citizen of the world, a better place to live that is a little bit more equal. But I don't know if we're really there yet.
Marco, what do you think?
Yeah, that the system mainly came from the US and that we followed in that sense. When you take the Greenland, that was for Europe the red line that the US crossed. So there we there we pointed out, like, now you crossed the line. So that comes also from our inner European rule of law. Mm-hmm. So it's also kind of a mechanism that that comes into effect when we see, okay, this is our rule of law, even though it originates from the US. So in that sense, I don't think we need a total new reset. It will create even more chaos, only because of the US is not following the rule of law that we used to.
And I mean, some you mentioned a number of success of the importance of international law, because we always see the negative and not the positive, right? Also, something that I think is quite very interesting is something that when we studied international law would have not even been conceivable. But for instance, the International Court of Justice have been used in recent years by states that doesn't have a direct interest in the dispute. Okay. Like for Syria under the torture conventions, for the genocide in Myanmar by Gambia. So the reason why Gambia pushed that is because they felt it's unfair that no one is pushing that at the international level. They have no direct interest in trying to have recognized the genocide in Myanmar, you know. So and this is something that was, I think, inconceivable 20 years ago, and is a very big achievement of it. Where that's going, I don't know, but there's a clear message from some states that they are not heard, and they want to be heard within the international framework, and I think that's a very important one. See, if I want to look at the positive side and why the system is still have tools that we can use, maybe. Yeah.
Is it also your experience?
No, I completely agree with Valerie. I think that we have, in a way, more avenues open for redress for victims than we had, 20 years ago. I think that basically is absolutely right, that the creative use that is being made of the International Court of Justice is something unprecedented in many ways. I mean, the International Court of Justice used to be an arcane, sleepy jurisdiction dealing with issues, connected to fisheries and continental shelves. And now we have, this dynamic in order to obtain redress for victims of massive international human rights law and international humanitarian law violations. The issue there is going to be, as usual, that is the second problem that we see, and I think that this is ICRAC as well, is kind of like what is the normative weight of the judgments coming from these bodies. And I think that over time what we are seeing is an erosion of the authoritative value of judicial decisions at the international level. So rulings from the European Court of Human Rights historically have been disregarded by some recalcitrant states. Cooperation with international criminal tribunals has always been a type of menu that the states decide when to, which plates they're going to choose and when to cooperate and when they decide to ignore. Binding requests for assistance, support for international criminal tribunals or other international mechanisms has been variable. And now we see that, a very easy solution is simply to ignore what the International Court of Justice says. And you get away with that. So that is a crack, because at the end of the day, obviously, enforcement has always been the Achilles heel of international law. But now I think we're seeing something else, which is kind of like a sort of disregard for the for those bodies that we have vested with the authority to decide on these issues.
That's a very good point. Richard, probably you can fill us with it. Generally, what we are observing is that, if my interests are not fulfilled, then I just don't want to be part of this organization, which we have recently seen. US has withdrawn from almost like 65 organizations. These are important ones. And before that, we have also seen CTBT or NPT, which were not ratified by the US. And I'm talking about probably 90s or so, early 90s. So the question is, what repercussions should it have if some of the countries, or especially the powerful countries, if they don't, follow the rule? Is it because the inbuilt helplessness in international law that we don't have, any force behind it?
I would say so. Of course, that disregard that was mentioned is worrisome. Again, to stress, it's not new. It's quite often been there. The Global South has been complaining about it, since time immemorial. Generally, we've said, let us think about it. We'll get back to you. You see that the legitimacy of international law has been affected as well. Indeed, countries asking themselves, is this helpful? What is this doing to me? I have complaints, but, it doesn't result in. I think, by and large, what you called that a living organism, right? International law, rule of law. That's indeed what it is. It's also subject to interpretation, subject to contestation. I think we see that unfolding. Sometimes people think that rule of law is as simple as, red light, you're not supposed to cross it, you get a fine. International law, for instance, there is a bit more wiggle room and room for interpretation as well. I think you see that process unfolding. I think by far most of the countries, and importantly, besides the US, because Trump's clearly said, international law, not for me, not for us. The other major actors, most of them, EU, India, China, Brazil, virtually all the middle powers, all the EU member states, much of the Global South is very much interested in sustaining it, in improving it where due. Of course, that improvement, that reform is something they've been complaining about, whether it's the P5, whether it's the US as a gatekeeper at the WTO, IMF, World Bank, certain veto powers. I think we're in the middle of that process. Of course, if the largest actor by most measures, the US, when it comes to some of the most fundamental issues, econ, security, military force, violence, doesn't play ball, and most likely for now we can presume that this whole MAGA philosophy will endure in some form or another, that is worrisome. But if the rest of the world, most and large, does, and they can and they want, I think that's positive.
I was trying to think of what you said, and now I lost my train of thought. What I think is important, and I think the reason why most of the states are still attached to multilateralism and international law is because at the end of the day, those rules are quite protective of states, state sovereignty, the borders. The basic rules is leave your neighbor alone, right? That's basically what we are asking, and then we can build cooperation on that. And so obviously, like something like what happened in Venezuela now is problematic for the basic rule of international law, right? Because not only you intervene in the internal affair of foreign states, but also you completely disregard head of state immunity, you know, which in other contexts I may not defend in the context of international crimes or something. Yeah. But in this context, I think we are forgetting a little bit that these rules are primarily meant to protect the states so that they can then build some kind of cooperation that will then help the citizens. So I think it's totally normal that to some degree multilateralism will remain, you know, because most states have interest into it, especially the ones that are not the most powerful, and that's also short-term thinking, right? Now I'm the most powerful, so I don't care, but what about tomorrow, you know? And then there was another point I wanted to make, but I forgot, so maybe
No, but I think that's very quite relevant. That reminds me of Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes. And think probably he emphasized that social contract theory simply because of it, whatever he observed in, I think, 16th century England. And he writes that in the state of nature, when there is no law, the life is short, nasty, and brutish. So irrespective of which form you have, it's better to have some kind of contract. And I think that's where your point is quite relevant.
Yeah, and now it came back. I also think it's really hard to imagine a world without this multilateralism and cooperation between states. I mean, the world is getting more international by the day, right? The issues that we have to deal with are global. The whole economy is interconnected. The global pandemic, the global warming is not something we can solve at the national level. All of this issue is, it's hard to imagine that this can be done without international law. So, yeah, so I guess it's for citizens wherever we are in the West, especially in the European Union, we are dependent of this system. We are completely interlinked with it. So I think the solution doesn't come from closing down to your national border and thinking individually, but to think as a community, you know.
And if I may add to that,
please.
Of course, thinking of a community for a long time wasn't the case. For the last 500 years, the West, have dominated disproportionately a lot of the other, because don't forget, concepts like order, law, rule of law, international law, also have their origins in civilizational principles and values. And it was the West that has dominated much of the last few hundred years. And now you see civilizational states, India, China, but also pockets of the Islamic world, who are now regaining confidence and agency indeed, to add value to international law and how that's interpreted and how that is applied. That, of course, should be considered as very positive. Because if international law is mostly seen as the product of 12% of world's population, the West, it will always lack the legitimacy by the other 88. They need to see their own principles and values reflected in international law. So in that regard, a potentially most constructive transitionary period, especially with Uncle Sam stepping back.
So could we say that this could also be a short-sightedness on part of the powerful nations at the moment? Because, I mean, as you see in the car, the window mirror, it says objects may be closer than than they appear. So this cracks in rule of law could also come back to bite someday. And we have seen this time a little bit retreat from the Greenland rhetoric, in the Davos conference. Do you think that's also?
Yeah, I think at the end it's very positive that we find the US. There was never a real European feeling. We always felt like in some way connected to the US. So I think what you mentioned, the shift of power of the Western world, directly is linked with the cracks that we see now in the law of rule.
Yeah, rule of law. Any thoughts on this? No, you're fine. I have this a thought, and I just want, because we are left with a little bit time. If a country has elections, has courts, and has laws, but there is no trust among the public, is it still the rule of law?
Well, I also heard at the table that the rule of law is connected to democracy.
Mm-hmm.
But if you ask the Chinese leaders, do you have a rule of law? They will also say, yes, we have also laws in place.
Yeah.
So you can have a debate on what does it mean, rule of law. Is it how the Western world is looking at it?
Yeah.
Or does it mean that the political leaders cannot overrule the law? Or is it there are laws in place who gives their people predictability and trust? Mm-hmm. So that is a whole debate in itself.
Okay.
I think the World Justice Project has a rule of law index that they publish every year. Mm-hmm. Basically, look at different states and see how they're doing throughout, a range of different indicators, with the usual champions: Norway, Denmark, Sweden, at the top, New Zealand. Which is interesting because when you look at the Human Development Index, the same countries are also on top. So there is kind of like there is a direct connection between quality of life, ability to develop your life in a proper manner with the amount of rule of law that you're getting as an average citizen. But the issue of trust is clear there, and I think that one thing that we do in IDLO, and I think is a key component of our work, is you work with local justice actors. Because a number of times what ends up happening is kind of like the lack of trust also revolves around politicization of the judiciary, for instance, or bureaucratization of the judiciary, like lack of responses in terms of the ability to solve a dispute within a reasonable period of time. And therefore people basically, when we're talking about, for instance, a pastoral society in Western Africa where land disputes are frequent, if you don't have proper dispute resolution mechanisms at the grassroots level, at the local level, then the rest of the rule of law conversation becomes somewhat abstract, right? I mean, you're not really solving people's problems. So I think that there is an issue there in terms of, how do institutions respond to the concrete needs of people? Just to give you a sense, what has been measured is that the vast majority of the conflicts in the world are not solved by the judicial system, but by customary and informal justice systems. So community justice, tribal justice mechanisms. So how do you basically, sometimes the best thing that you can do is work with those systems to improve them, to empower them, and to basically include them within the traditional justice response to this type of conflicts. So I think that for me the question there, it also becomes an issue in terms of how do you rebuild trust. And sometimes, that requires, having a clinical look at your institutions, how they're working at the macro and at the micro level, and basically engaging with those institutions and making them deliver for the people. That is an essential component.
Yeah, I would like to add something to that. If we measure the rule of law on predictability and accountability and reflect that to the people, like you questioned, then there are countries that, if you look at the US, which is now very unpredictable, so there are authoritarian states that offers their people much more predictability and accountability than currently the US. So that's something to take on.
Absolutely.
I think for me, clearly the answer is no. You can completely have a system which have laws, system in place, even elections, and that are not also, because that still is the power that is using this law, not that they are bound by this law, right? That's where the difference lies. Maybe to close back to your example at the beginning, when you were giving the example of South Korea, which is a very powerful example where the rule of law is implemented by the people themselves, And you look at the situation in Iran right now, which is that's the first thought that came to my mind when you were giving this example. is exactly the opposite. You have a system in place. You have very functional court in Iran. I mean, or legal system to be implemented. You have people in the streets, and then we know the very grave situation right now for the people, the excessive use of force against the people that is unprecedented. And so that's, to me, is exactly the example of a system where it's ruled by law, but on the benefit of the powerful, right? Not.
So it's not rule of law,
So
in your opinion?
No.
No. Richard?
In a very unpredictable society, of course.
Yes, of course.
No, very briefly, if that system is effective, fair, and transparent, as it is in much of our part of the world here, and countries also mentioned here, Fabricio, then that absolutely the trust will be there. I think Scandinavia in particular, but also Holland, where we sit, the indices and other metrics show that.
So you're saying if these 2-3 elements are there, the trust is also bound to be there?
By and large, yes.
Is it
by and large?
By and large.
Fair, effective, transparent. Example of the US that was given. Of course, it's no longer entirely fair or effective or transparent, and you see that trust eroding.
Well, I think we have just 3 minutes left, so it's a just very wonderful conversation, and I wanted to go on and on. But say if the elected governments, they themselves undermine the rule of law, what can be done to stop them? Who would like to start?
Well, that's to some degree what we are doing as civil society, working on human rights and trying to use international law. So we work a lot with partners that are working in countries, activists in the countries, documenting those violations committed against their citizens at the national level. And obviously, if there is no will for it to be addressed at the national level, the only tools you are left with is international law with its weaknesses. But I think international law can be one of these tools that we are trying to use to put pressure on those states that are not respecting basic rights for the people at the international level.
Yeah, what we have done in ID law is in context of erosion of the rule of law and basically transitions to autocratic governments is try to work with the judiciary to the extent that the judiciary can still operate as a bulk work of the rule of law and offer a degree of protection, empower justice seekers, just work with the local bar associations, give lawyers the capacity and the means to be able to defend the rights of people in a rarefied atmosphere. In some countries, we have to basically abandon working with the governments altogether and just shift to support civil society and to try to basically make sure that we can for instance, support the women and girls in contexts where there is widespread gender violence. So I think that you have to find the way and define the strategy around the country you're dealing with, that particular its structures and then act accordingly.
Richard, 10 seconds.
1 second, even I have little to add.
So you and Marco.
Little to add.
No. Okay. Well. I think I would like to thank you all very much for sparing time with us, Marco, Fabricio, Richard, and Valerie, for this engaging and insightful conversation. With this, we come to the end of our first segment, but stay tuned for our next one shortly with Julie Taylor on expat entrepreneurship. Before I leave, I would like to thank you all sitting there at home watching us, to invite you to join me again for our local election special on Saturday, February 28th. Until then, take very good care of yourself and your loved ones. This is Sanjay Sharma. Bye for now.